The workings of the human mind is a complex subject. The limiting factor, however, in studying the human mind is that it requires the human mind itself for studying it. The human mind, with all of its cultural biases, political preferences, views on life, etc. A scientist should not be biased or influenced by a certain doctrine or set of beliefs before diving deep into something, let alone to then become an expert. The scientist should be able to let go of his preconceived notions when the conclusions of an experiment differ from his expectations. Psychoanalysis, psychology, and psychiatry are words that sometimes mean the same thing or are interchanged unintentionally. But one thing is certain. Psychoanalysis is considered to be a science, or at least a credible and valuable branch of mental health care. Psychology as a practice is a highly respected and accepted practice that comes with its own organizations, companies, medicine, studies, and experts or authorities on a subject of the human mind. The notion that the human mind itself is a limiting factor in understanding the human mind objectively, one has to wonder if practicing psychologists can ever work objectively, as science is supposed to be objective. That being said though, psychology is an important study. It is a great step towards understanding the human mind and behavior, and we should not attempt to discredit by default a movement or science that aims to take humanity to an enlightened state. However, like every science or religion even, psychology, or rather psychoanalysis, has its beginning. We have all heard of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the Freudian slip of the tongue, the Jungian interpretation of dreams, then there are Neo-Freudians and Jungian academies, etc. In this presentation I will highlight some interesting and peculiar details surrounding the implementation of psychoanalysis and how it could be seen as something that has been weaponized or at least been utilized for dubious other purposes by a certain collective of intellectuals, starting around the 1950s mostly. Apart from being recognized as the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud identified strongly with the Jewish people, himself being Jewish. In fact, what to non-Jews would seem like a rather arbitrary factor in Freud's psychoanalytical work, to Freud and his fellow Jewish colleagues it was an important factor. To them, their Jewish ancestry became a force that drove psychoanalysis onto another path, one could argue. One of many examples of Freud's favoritism and even supremacist views can be found in his own words. He felt a racial kinship when working with fellow Jewish colleagues, and he felt a racial strangeness even with his disciple Carl Jung, being a non-Jew, or as Freud would refer to him, a Gentile. Colleagues of Freud were suspicious of Jung because of his non-Jewish genetic background, and they found it to be important enough to talk about. Also, Freud was seen as a kind of father figure to his colleagues and disciples. It is reported that they would imitate Freud's mannerism and views as to express their utter appreciation for him. This ironically might be a Freudian aspect to their own psychology. Freud was very vigilant when it comes to anti-Semitism and, quote, Aryan heritage, as he would not refer to the Germans and the French to be German and French, but rather Aryan, Gentiles, or sometimes even Goyim. Goyim, a derogatory word used by Jews to refer to non-Jews. In personal conversations and letters, Freud openly expressed his dislike of the Gentile culture and showed absolute favoritism towards the Jewish race, it being the superior one. Freud wrote extensively about the modern world of the West and how its qualities have a negative effect on the human psyche. Like Karl Marx, Freud shared his view on capitalism and greed, like many of his followers and supporters did and still might do, identifying these aspects as the reason for society's breakdown and the imminent breakdown of mental health. Freud and most of his followers were political leftists, and later on, psychoanalysis would become a useful political tool. We could argue that psychoanalysis is a product of its time. Hannah Arendt, a Jewish philosopher and political theorist who studied under Martin Heidegger, wrote extensively on totalitarianism. Peculiar, since Heidegger and Arendt seem to have differing ideas when it comes to Judaism and racial studies or views. However, Arendt's influence in political theory is still present today. She began researching anti-Semitism during the 1920s for the Zionist Federation of Germany. In the 1920s, most of the top psychoanalysts were Bolsheviks and Trotsky supporters. It is at this point that we can debate whether or not psychoanalysis or even political theory has become a science, or that it was a tool for subversion all along. If not from its inception, then at least it became a political tool not much later. Now, Erich Fromm, a neo-Freudian, has written extensively on individual freedom, psychology, and also favorably on Karl Marx. It is at this point that we can safely assume that Fromm is at least politically left-wing and possibly a Marxist. Now, that would not have been much of a red flag if Fromm wasn't a prominent figure of the Frankfurt School of Social Research. Its members were predominantly Jewish, who were associated with the Institute for Social Research during the Weimar era in Germany. In fact, the first generation of the Frankfurt School were all Jewish. During this era, sociology or social studies were called Jewish science. The Nazis considered this branch and the school itself to be a communist organization, which was a threat to society and the state. We could say that the Frankfurt School used Freud's theories to critique Gentile culture while boasting about their Jewish heritage. Something called critical theory was invented to be used for critiquing society and to then change it. One might say that this itself is an authoritarian way of asserting influence. And today we have organizations like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which is a Jewish organization. Its mission is to stop and prevent hate speech, anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry, etc. But all according to their own definitions. This is yet another Jewish group of intellectuals who have made it their business, literally, to influence the Gentile culture. Now, this is not to say that they used Freud's work, but it is another Jewish collective, one of many since the inception of the Frankfurt School, which makes it their mission to alter the way people think about the world, but mostly how the world thinks about Jews. Now, to be fair, Freud's words have also been mistranslated, or at the very least misinterpreted, according to BRUNO Bettelheim. The German language has a certain depth that is hard to translate into another language because of its layered nature. That is just how it is. Now, possibly for this reason, Freud himself was afraid that his theories would end up in doctors' hands. Bettelheim explains this in his book Freud and Man's Soul, where he rectifies the most important mistranslations. He explains how Freud in German uses the word soul instead of mind more often. But the translations make him seem like he's more mechanical because of the word soul not being there. Some say that the mistranslations were a deliberate act in order to make Freud seem like a stern and cold man, a father figure indeed. And it is true that Freud's theories are an industry standard in today's mental health studies. But to add to the suspicion and conspiratorial mindset, Bruno Bettelheim was Jewish himself. In fact, Bettelheim states this very fact on the first page of the first chapter of this book. Should we therefore view his book with suspicion? I think not. Let's keep an open mind. But pointing out that Judaism in the early stages of the Frankfurt School in particular, and how Freud and his colleagues heavily identified with being Jewish, and made a clear distinction between being a Jew and a non-Jew, it all makes it seem a bit odd and peculiar. One may think it could discredit the very foundation of mental health care, but let's not take it that far. We can safely assume that Jews have felt a racial brotherhood throughout time, and that is good. This has allowed them to form groups and organizations which to this very day are still very much alive and active. All of them are there to change the course of society. One may question if it benefits the Jewish community or society as a whole. Just how inclusive are these collectives? All this is not to discredit the works of Freud, but I'm only highlighting the peculiar Jewish influence in a scientific branch that has risen to great heights and importance. My previous video about porn and awards was also about the vast Jewish influence in the porn industry, which is an interesting subject when viewed in a psychological, or should we say, psychoanalytical way. We see how porn has influenced and infected the minds of many of both genders, young and old. We see how society and culture have adopted this industry. When researching various organizations having to do with cultural reformation or political activism, we can see that most of them are founded and/or funded by Jews, claiming to speak on behalf of all of us, while perhaps unintentionally implementing critical theory. NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, then rise in popularity and reach authoritarian levels. Being critical of these organizations is considered to be hateful, and in most cases, anti-Semitic, which again is authoritarian. All because they are Jewish organizations. And so the cycle continues, giving the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, all the more reason to keep on doing what it's doing. Paideia, an organization led by Barbara Lerner-Specter, aims to make Europe more multicultural. This was also an attempt to fight anti-Semitism. All very bold statements, but she makes these claims with full confidence and authority. The interesting thing is that its members are mostly Jewish, including Barbara Specter. Another interesting fact is that Paideia is not operating from Israel, but from Sweden. Jews claiming to speak for all of us, that Europe needs to be more multicultural and that Europe has an anti-Semitism problem. Now, definitions shared by Freud and colleagues a long time ago. Organizations like these are beginning to look more like think tanks, because they seem to influence culture and society more and more. Does it not seem like all these people are projecting their own ideas and views onto the world around them and asserting an authoritarian status? Is this not, dare I say, Freudian? Even Albert Einstein did not come up with several of the theories that are attached to his name to this day. Also from that era, Einstein was a communist and has been caught plagiarizing. What exactly happened in that era? Why are these prominent Jewish people so hell-bent on subverting a culture that is basically alien to theirs? Why do the ADL and SPLC have the legal power to try and fire people from their jobs. People that, in their eyes, are anti-Semitic or racist. Why is there such a focus on anti-Semitism? It already began with Freud. There's a quote going around that says, "No anti-Semitism without Semitism." So this means that the focus on Jews has become a thing, and you're not allowed to critique them. Pretty authoritarian, I would say.